So let us look at the first chapter of Rorty's book, Contingency, Irony and Solidarity. And this first chapter is called The Contingency of Language. So in one way or another, we know that Rorty is going to tell us that there is something about language that is not characterized by necessity, but that is instead historical, maybe full of accidents and idiosyncrasies. And so one of the things we will be on the lookout in this chapter is, well, what exactly is this contingency of language and why is it important to us? I would like to start at a very traditional place, I guess, which is the first sentence of the chapter. The first sentence goes like this. About 200 years ago, the idea that truth was made rather than found began to take hold of the imagination of Europe. I think Rorty probably thought a long while about this sentence because it is pretty much perfect as an introduction to what he is going to do. First, about 200 years ago, Rorty immediately indicates that what he is going to tell us is a historical narrative. Right? So what Rorty is going to give us here in the entire book, but also in this particular chapter, is not a sort of timeless argument leading up to the truth of some particular thesis. No, he is going to give us a historical narrative. He is going to tell us that, look, how did we end up in the situation that we are in now? And of course, in telling us how we ended up in the situation that we are in now, he is giving a particular kind of description of this situation that we are in now. Right? So Rorty has very much taken to heart the, shall we say, Hegelian lesson that to give a historical story, to give a historical explanation of how we ended up in a particular situation, is to come to understand the situation that we are in a particular way. So Rorty is going to tell us a history with the aim of making us accept a certain picture of who we are. And if we accept a certain picture of who we are, that might make us want to accept certain ideas about where we should go from here. Right? So that's the kind of thing that we can expect from Rorty. Now, what is that story about? That historical story is going to be about the idea that truth was made rather than found. The idea that truth is made rather than found. Now, this immediately is going to turn out to have to do with language. Because Rorty's main argument for the claim that truth is made rather than found, or maybe I should say his main way of making it intelligible that truth is made rather than found, is going to involve talking about language. It's going to involve pointing out that truths only exist in languages, and that languages are made rather than found. That is going to be sort of the main burden of Rorty's story, how he came to see that languages are made rather than found, and thereby that truth is made rather than found. Now, obviously, there is a certain way in which it is trivially true that languages are made rather than found. Right? Yeah, I mean, otherwise, why would there be all these languages? Right? I mean, clearly we've made them. Clearly these languages have a history. Clearly these languages change. That is, I don't know whether everybody everywhere always has thought that way about language. I mean, who knows what Plato is up to in the Cratylus. But that is like a generally accepted picture, I would say, of language and has been for a very long time. But when Rorty tells us that languages have been made rather than found, he means something a little bit more... Oh, I need to take this. Sorry for that interruption. So what I was saying is that for Rorty, the idea that language is made rather than found is... it has a more substantial meaning. Right? What it means is that as we develop languages, we are not being led to a particular language through, let's say, a recognition of some kind of linguistic structure or language-like structure that is already there. That is already there in the world, or that is already there in us human beings. Right, so one way of thinking about the development of language is to think of the development of language as we slowly creating a language that fits the world. Right, so the world would have some kind of quasi-linguistic structure, And slowly but surely our human languages are going to mirror that quasi-linguistic structure, and they become the right kind of language with which to describe the world. If that's the story that you're telling about language, then yeah, there is a sense in which languages are made, but there's also a sense in which languages are found, right? Because we make our language in such a way that it fits this structure that we find, right? That's already there in the world, or maybe not in the world, maybe it's in ourselves, or maybe it's in God, but it's somewhere to be found. That picture is what Rorty is going to completely reject. Right? So one of the main things that Rorty will want to do in this chapter is to tell us that no, the way that language evolves is not like that at all. It is not about finding a pre-existing quasi-linguistic structure and then making language fit that structure. Okay, so that is, the content of the historical narrative. And then, about 200 years ago, the idea that truth was made rather than found began to take hold of the imagination of Europe. Here we have again a sort of indication of Rorty's philosophical methodology. It wasn't seen to be true in Europe. It wasn't sort of, we finally found the arguments for it in Europe. No, it took hold of the imagination of Europe. It was like a creative thing that happened, not an argumentative thing, and something that people embraced maybe on, for almost aesthetic reasons, or, all kinds of reasons that couldn't be reduced to purely logical thinking. And because Rorty is going to tell us, we will see this soon, that's not the way that philosophy works. Right? According to Rorty, the really important epoch-making philosophy is not the philosophy that says, well, here are my premises, you probably all agree with them, now let's see what kind of conclusion I can get from that. Here, now you have to be convinced of this conclusion too. Okay, so there's a lot happening here in this first sentence. It's telling us what the chapter is going to be about, and it's telling us how the chapter is going to be about it. It's going to tell us a historical narrative that is put forward as a possible self-description that we might want to embrace, and Rorty's hope is that it's going to take hold of our imagination. So, I think that should really help putting all the things that happen in this chapter into the right perspective. And in a sense, it sets the framework for the entire book, right? This is the kind of way that Rorty is going to be writing. Let's look at Rorty's story in a little bit more detail. So this idea that truth was made rather than found, Rorty begins by making that more vivid for us, by telling us about two groups of philosophers. There's a group of philosophers who see themselves as allied to science, and who think that this is a totally wrong way of talking, right? They think that it doesn't make any sense to talk about truth being made rather than found, because, truths they're about the world, right? When we are in search of truths, what are we doing? Well, we are trying to describe the world the way that it really is. So truths are found rather than made. What on earth is Rorty talking about? That would be the first group. And the second group of philosophers, and Rorty says that they have arranged themselves alongside the political utopian and the innovative artist. But I think it's fair to say, and we quickly meet this, that they would also range themselves around a certain conception of the scientist. The scientist as a creative, paradigm-changing genius who generates new insights into nature basically by coming up with new metaphors, with new ways of thinking about nature. I mean, that would fit there as well. So I think it's a little bit misleading to see this as a pro-science and an anti-science group of philosophers. That's not really the way to think about it. And indeed, I mean, political utopians and innovative artists, I guess that the truth is found rather than made group would also, have conservative politicians and non-innovative artists in their midst. So this is not really science versus art or something like that. It is working within a pre-given framework versus radically changing that framework, including the standards of argumentation. That is the sort of duality that Rorty is positing for us. And it's clear which group he prefers, right? He prefers the radical group, the people who think that truth is made rather than found. Rorty brings in Kant and Hegel for a little bit, and we don't need to delve into Kant and Hegel at this point, but the important idea is that what Kant and Hegel do is that they basically tell us that the way that we understand nature is, in some sense, generated by mind or spirit or cognition. So Kant would say that, the entire structure of nature, like the laws of nature, not maybe like the particular laws of nature, but the law-like structure of nature, including even space and time, by the way, are in some sense dependent on the human mind. And so any truths that we tell about the empirical world are in some sense made by us, rather than merely found. And Hegel has a slightly different story, but it sort of fits the same mold, although Hegel is generally read as talking more about some kind of, well, he likes to talk not about like the particular human mind, but about the absolute spirit, which seems to be something that maybe the human mind is only a kind of part of or reflection of or partakes in or something like that. Either way, what Rorty suggests is that Kant and Hegel don't go far enough, because although they claim that truth is made rather than found when it comes to the external world, they claim that truth is found rather than made when it comes to understanding this mind or this absolute spirit. And Rorty himself says, so we need to move beyond that, and that is one of the things that we've been doing in philosophy, moving even beyond Kant and Hegel, and claiming that there is nothing that has an intrinsic nature, right? And with an intrinsic nature, Rorty here means something, a nature that something has independently of the way that we describe it and understand it and interact with it and so on and so forth. So if we think that there is this independent nature out there that, remains the same no matter what we do and how we think about it and how we consider it, then there is something out there to be found to which our ideas, our language our ideas and language have to fit it. And so truth would be found rather than made. We need to get rid of the idea of an intrinsic nature, and that will help us, understand this idea that truth is made rather than found. Now, nevertheless, this seems to be a very paradoxical claim, because surely most of the time we find truth rather than make it. If somebody asks you, if somebody says, Victor Gijsbers, that guy, has a bust of a philosopher on his desk, which philosopher? Well, how do you find out? Well, you find out, right? You don't make it true. You don't come up with the idea that, this Gijsbers guy, he must have a bust of Kant because he did some videos about that. Pretty good guess, but it's wrong. You don't make the truth by saying, it must be something totally unexpected. Maybe it's Carl Schmitt. Well, no, it's not Carl Schmitt. In fact, the best way for you is to find out, is to, well, maybe not come to my house because I probably don't know you, but to check it out. Like, this is the bust that I'm holding up right now, and it is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche. Yes, that is the guy whose bust I have on my desk. That seems to be a truth that we find rather than make, right? So what on earth is Rorty talking about? Well, if we want to understand what Rorty is talking about, I think it is useful to look at, page, the very bottom of page 4. That would be a good place to start. So I'm going to read you out some of the things that Rorty says on page 4, 5, 6, maybe 7. So here's the very bottom of page 4. We need to make a distinction between the claim that the world is out there and the claim that truth is out there. To say that the world is out there, that it is not our creation, is to say with common sense that most things in space and time are the effects of causes which do not include human mental states. So that's a kind of complicated way of saying that, the world exists independently of what you believe and desire and so on and so forth. And sometimes your beliefs and desires have an impact on the world, but most of the time it's just there. Right? If you really want me to have a bust of Carl Schmitt on my desk, Or if you really believe that I have a bust of Carl Schmitt on my desk, there's still not a bust of Carl Schmitt on my desk, right? It's still Friedrich Nietzsche, and it is going to stay that way. So that Rorty completely agrees with that. But to say that truth is not out there is simply to say that where there are no sentences, there is no truth. That sentences are elements of human languages, and that human languages are human creations. So what Rorty wants to insist on here is that truth, what kind of thing is true? Well, that Nietzsche bust isn't true. Sentences are true. Sentences only exist in a language. So truths only exist in a language. And languages are made rather than found. Okay. The reason that it nevertheless sounds strange to say that we make truth, Rorty tells us, is because we tend, and this is halfway through page 5, we tend to confine our attention to single sentences as opposed to vocabularies. This is crucial for understanding what Rorty means. We tend to confine our attention to single sentences as opposed to vocabularies. We often let the world decide the competition between alternative sentences, for instance, between red wins and black wins, or between the butler did it and the doctor did it. If we have a vocabulary, and by that Rorty means, some coherent part of a language that allows us to talk about certain things with each other. And so when Rorty talks about a language or a vocabulary, he generally isn't thinking about something like English or French, like English vocabulary or French vocabulary. But generally he's thinking maybe more of something like the language of analytic philosophy, or the vocabulary of modern statistics, or that kind of more local stuff. Although we can talk about the terms that we use in daily life too. So what Rorty says is, if you have a vocabulary, if you have a way of talking, then we often check out the world to see which of these sentences we ought to affirm. And having programmed ourselves with a language, Rorty literally says this. This is on page 6. The world can, once we have programmed ourselves with a language, cause us to hold beliefs, but it cannot propose a language for us to speak. If I have a language, looking at the world is going to give me all kinds of beliefs, and so there's a sense in which I'm finding truths. But that is conditional on having this language, on having this vocabulary, on having this particular way of talking about the world. How to talk about the world, which vocabulary to embrace, that, Rorty insists, is not something that we get from the world. Right? The world doesn't speak. The world cannot propose a language for us to speak. Only other human beings can do that. And so on and so forth. So Rorty is not denying that we can find truths. He's just saying that we can only find truths if we have already accepted a certain language, which, is going to involve certain methods of finding out that certain sentences are true or false. But which language to speak, which vocabulary to use, which concepts to use, that is not something that we get from the world. That is something that we ourselves make, that we ourselves develop. Now, if you will recall, at the beginning of this lecture, I told you that when Rorty wants to say that truth is made rather than found, and that language is made rather than found, what is important for him is to get rid of the view that our languages are created in order to fit some pre-existing linguistic structure in the world. And so that's basically the point that Rorty is making here. Right? That's not how it works. Right? We don't find in the world a particular language, a particular set of concepts that we have to use. We create concepts and then we apply them to the world. And sometimes that is going to be very successful given our aims. And sometimes it's not going to be successful given our aims. And as our aims change, and as the concepts that we've come up with change throughout history, the ways that we will be talking change. All right. So Rorty is going to say a little bit more about how that works later on. But this is the basic picture. Now, one of the things that Rorty himself and people like Rorty have often been accused of is that they are somehow enemies of truth. right? And people might say things like, oh, they are the people who made fake news possible, or, who have made everybody believe that you can just say whatever you want and get away with it because there's no truth out there. And I think that is based on a totally mistaken conception of what somebody like Rorty is doing. Right, so let's take an example that, I'm making this video in 2021. An example that a lot of people have been talking about is the claim that Joe Biden won the 2020 US presidential election. And a lot of people think that is true, but some people hold on to the claim that it's false, that actually Donald Trump won the election. So what would Rorty say about that? Right? Would he say, well, you make your own truth, and, for Trump, it's true that he himself won, or something like that. Or if Trump supporters had managed to overrun the Capitol and forced people to declare him victorious, then he would have won the elections. No, I don't think that Rorty would be saying that at all. Rorty's point is not that you can hold anything true or make anything true, whatever you please. Rorty's point is that the vocabulary we use to describe things, that is something that we make, and the world is not going to tell us which vocabulary to use. If we accept the vocabulary of 21st century democratic politics, then clearly the true statement is that Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential US elections. But we don't have to accept that vocabulary. So suppose that somebody is here who says, well, Joe Biden didn't win the elections. There were no real elections, right? Everybody in the United States is completely under the control of brainwashing media, under the control of capitalist power structures. It's all a sham. There's no real election. People feel that they have a choice, but actually these candidates are just the same. So there was no election. I'm not saying that this is the right thing to say, right? But this is an example. It makes some sense to say this, right? I mean, we can imagine somebody who would say this. That would be somebody who believes that the vocabulary, the way of thinking about and talking about elections and politics, under which it is true that Joe Biden won an election, is a vocabulary that should be thrown out and replaced by a radically new vocabulary that has a radically different conception of what an election would be like, and what democracy would be like, and what the legitimate way of getting a president is. That is the kind of person of whom Rorty would say, well, you can't say that he's wrong, or at least you can't say that the world shows that he is wrong. This person is putting forward a new way of talking that we may want to accept or not accept, but that we can't just push aside by saying that it's false, right? Because it doesn't fit our vocabulary. These are two different proposals for how to talk. Okay, I hope that helps. I hope that helps understanding the role that truth plays, and the way that people like Rorty think about truth, and why it's not the same as, throwing out truth and saying that every conspiracy theory is just as good as everything else. Okay, so a couple more things in this video, and I'm going to do the second half of the chapter in the next video. Having told this story about truth, Rorty is now going to tell us a little bit about the way that cultural change works. So how do we get from speaking one language to another language? Well, not by argumentation. And we can already sort of see why it couldn't be by argumentation, because if there are two completely different ways of speaking, well, argument's always going to fit into one of these ways of speaking, and somebody in the other way of speaking is not going to find it very, he's not, like arguments, if there's a way of speaking A and B, an argument formulated with concepts A is not going to look very persuasive to somebody who speaks in concepts B, and the other way around. This is basically what Thomas Kuhn, the famous philosopher of science, has called incommensurability. And Rorty is going to mention Kuhn a couple of times in the pages that come after. The way that Rorty is thinking about cultural change here is very closely allied to the way that Thomas Kuhn thinks about scientific change and paradigm changes. So cultural change of this magnitude, Rorty tells us, does not result from applying criteria any more than individuals become theists or atheists or shift from one spouse or circle of friends to another as a result either of applying criteria or of acte gratuit. So really what Rorty is saying is that you don't use arguments, nor do you make just some arbitrary decision in getting from one vocabulary to another. That couldn't be the way that things work. He goes on to say, this is at the bottom of page 6, that the temptation to look for criteria is a species of the more general temptation to think of the world or the human self as possessing an intrinsic nature, an essence. And the idea would be that if there's an intrinsic nature of things, if there's an essence, something that is independent of how we talk about it, then that could give us insight into that essence, into that intrinsic nature, could give us the framework, a neutral framework, an objective framework in which we can assess what is the right way of talking, what is the right vocabulary. If there's nothing like that, if there's nothing we can grasp independently of our ways of speaking, then there is no neutral ground on which we can find which way of speaking is the right way of speaking. And so to get from one way of speaking to another way of speaking, it doesn't happen because we have arguments for it, at least not some kind of knockdown argument that shows that you've got to reject that and you've got to embrace this other thing. Although, and Rorty doesn't really say this, but I would say that always a lot of argumentation takes place. I mean, just check out something like a paradigm change in science. People like Galilei were arguing all the time with their opponents, even if the arguments they maybe didn't work in standard ways. They didn't produce conviction in the opponent. They still played a role. But okay, that's not Rorty's point here. So we don't move from one way of speaking to another by way of argument. We also don't move from one way of speaking towards the other by just deciding it. Right? I mean, how do you do that? I wake up tomorrow and I'm like, well, let me accept this totally different way of thinking about the world. Yeah, I mean, that you can't really change your beliefs like that, right? Maybe sometimes you wake up in the morning and suddenly find that your beliefs have changed, but it wasn't really a decision. Okay, Rorty's story is that what actually happens is a slow process of cultural change. And one of the things that he wants to do in the rest of the article is to tell us a little bit about how, according to him, this kind of cultural change takes place. Because what he needs to do is he needs to make it at least intelligible that the cultural change from one language to another is not to be understood in terms of getting closer and closer and closer to the way that the world wants to be spoken about. But Rorty needs a way of talking about cultural change, of talking about a change in how we speak, that doesn't need to posit an intrinsic nature of reality, and so doesn't need to posit, change through argumentation, or change through sudden insight into the nature of the real. Well, what is that story? It's a story that is going to involve metaphor, and he's going to talk a lot about Donald Davidson, and that is what I want to look at in the next video. So last thing I want to say here is that on page 9, Rorty, at the top of page 9, he has a pretty nice characterization of philosophy, where he tells us that interesting philosophy is rarely an examination of the pros and cons of a thesis. Usually it is, implicitly or explicitly, a contest between an entrenched vocabulary which has become a nuisance and a half-formed neo-vocabulary which vaguely promises great things. And again, this is a picture of change that, well, first of all, I would love us philosophy professors to embrace that, but it's really hard for us to do that and not tell our students that it's all about good argumentation. Second, this is a way of thinking about change that fits very well with authors like Kuhn and Feyerabend and the way that they speak about changes in scientific thinking. Alright, see you in the next video.